Please be seated. The court is now back in session. Once again, the floor is given to the prosecution to continue putting questions to the expert. That you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Short, I just want to follow up with a couple of questions on that last passage we looked at relating to the killings of foreigners captured by the Khmer Rouge from 1970 onward. If I can ask you first, were these, as far as your research takes you, were these the first examples or manifestations or perhaps events or incidents where we have information of the Khmer Rouge executing people?
No, they are not the first instances. The beginning, I think, was in Ratanakiri, when, after the Samlot uprising, fighting started in other parts of the country. And during that period, when prisoners were captured, the description I was given was that if they were local people, in other words, government forces fighting against the Khmer Rouge, if the soldier captured was a local person and was known, then he might be released unharmed. If he was not known, he would be killed. So there was a take no prisoners policy from the beginning, and that's really where it started.
Thank you. And just one more question on this, on these events. As far as your research takes you, this policy of if they're not with us, they're against us, or a line, was it in that period promulgated within the party? Was it a line, a principle, a instruction, or I'll let you use the right word, that was being promulgated within the party to cadre, to combatants, etc.?
It was a question I asked those whom I interviewed, and the answer was no. There was no written instruction. It was just what you did, what you knew you had to do, what you knew the party would want you to do. Now, how they knew, no instruction, but it was clearly understood to be the case.
And if I can ask that question differently, in your research, has your research yielded any evidence of instances where the leadership curtailed those practices or sought to punish or prevent such practices?
No. No evidence generally. There is the very specific case of François Bizot, who was released allegedly on Dirk's recommendation by decision of Pol Pot. But that's a very special case. But generally, no.
Now, of course, we're still in the early 1970s, and your book describes the functioning of leadership and its officers in the Kampong Tom area. So I'll ask you a number of questions about the events there and some of the significant meetings. At page 223 of the book, you deal with the issue of admissions to the party. And of course, at this point, the front is already in existence, the FUNC. The relevant ERNs are in English 003 96423 and in French 00639 744. And this is what you had to say. From December 1970 onwards, recruits for the army and for funk were accepted regardless of their background, with no questions asked. But entry qualifications to the party were made even stricter. Students and middle peasants, defined as those with enough to eat all year round, who in the 1960s had been readily admitted as candidates for party membership, were now turned down flat, or at best allowed to join the youth league. Only poor peasants were deemed to have the right class origin for admission to the party ranks. Does this bear any significance as a development, what you seem to describe as an apparent narrowing of those of classes that would be considered appropriate for party membership?
I think there were two factors at work. One was, as the party joins or becomes part of a broader organization, the FUNC, so it is necessary to tighten the links within the party itself to make sure that it's not corrupted by becoming part of this larger organization. So in terms of ensuring that the party is a strong elite, not liable to be corrupted by being part of a larger organization, you tighten the entry qualifications, you ensure that only those people who have class origins which are supposed to guarantee their outlook will be members. The other element was 1970, the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, were in Cambodia in force. Again, that is a reason for making sure that the Khmers remain absolutely loyal to the Cambodian Communist Party, not looking at the Vietnamese as an alternative.
In this part of the book, you describe the establishment of offices, including an office with the code name 71, which you describe as, or rather, an area which you said was a whole central committee area known as S71. And you describe the establishment of an information section under an office known as S31. And in that context, I believe you described the presence of a number of intellectuals at this point in time. You then, or rather before I ask you this question, let me ask this. How does one explain the continuing presence, admission or otherwise contribution of intellectuals with what we just heard about peasants, lower class peasants being viewed as the primary pool from which the party would attract membership?
Intellectuals were necessary to run the propaganda apparatus and for the interface with the front. The two were not mutually exclusive, but the intellectuals were kept apart. They were people like Hu Nim, Hu Yuen, who had been in liaison with the party for many years, were nonetheless kept in a separate area. And just to give you an example of the compartmentalization, you couldn't, within S71, you could not go from one area to another without having a Jarai or other bodyguard to accompany you. It was very carefully separated.
And in that context, on the page that follow immediately this last quote, you, and in dealing with Office S31, which housed, as you said in the book, progressive figures, you then say the following: Khieu Samphan also spent time at S31, but because of his role in liaising with Sihanouk, was soon moved to a compound nearer Paul's headquarters. And on pages 226 to 227, in a different context, you make the point that he was the most trusted of the three, Khieu Samphan, Hu Yun and Hu Nim. Can I ask you first, what was the source for that, for your description of these movements of Khieu Samphan closer to Pol Pot? I should say there's no footnote in the book itself on this particular passage, and perhaps we can both.
4225. I can tell you those I spoke to. One of those I spoke to about this, and who was a very good informant, was Ping Soi, who worked there. But let me just see.
There are a number of references in relation to these pages 224 to 225. If you're unable to locate it quickly, we can move on and return to it if need be.
Well, just looking, the information section I've given the sources, the confessions of Tiv Ol and Hu Nim, which are held by DC Cam. Ping Soi as an interview about S31, again other confessions held by DC Cam. Yes, Ping Soi. The main source I remember is the interview with Ping Soi, but that is expanded by material from the confessions.
Can you tell us how you were able to conclude at this point in time that Khieu Samphan was the most trusted of the three, in brief terms, if you could?
The fact that he was moved to be close to Pol Pot, and that from that time on he remained close to Pol Pot, whereas the others were not. They had all come up together from Mount Oral when the Companton base was established. Khieu Samphan was singled out. And during that period, Pol Pot felt that Khieu Samphan should get married, and a marriage happened. It was arranged. So again, this is an unusual level of interest from a leader of Pol Pot standing in Khieu Samphan's well-being, as it were.
Thank you. On a slightly different topic, and if we can deal with these in brief terms, just in the interest of time, because we're covering a large number of areas. You discussed some of the decisions made in this early period in Kampong Tom. In fact, this is in the context of a Central Committee meeting, and this particular passage that I wish to take you to is at page 227, and the ERNs are 00396-427 in English and 00639-748 in French. You say the following: much of the meeting was taken up with housekeeping. New boundaries were agreed for the zones, together with a new set of code numbers. And then you give the code numbers. And then you say subsequently a new zone was created around Phnom Penh, designated as in Isarak times the special zone under the control of Vaughan Vet. The zones were in turn divided into regions, each also with its code number. Skipping one paragraph, the next one down, The meeting also approved the setting up of 3 distinct sets of military forces on the Viet Minh model: the CHLOP, or village patrols, which combined security and militia functions; regional troops operating at district level as a territorial defence; and main force units organised in the zones. Is that an important development in terms of dealing with issues of administrative structure and setting up zones and military forces as well as sectors below the zones?
Yes, it was, because, again, one needs to go back and look before at the very kind of skeletal structure that existed, with a very small number of guerrillas, with few party branches. The party was not strong in the countryside or indeed in the cities. It was a very small organization. Now the Vietnamese have come in. Large areas of the country are under communist control. The Cambodians have to build up quickly a structure which is capable of taking its place once the Vietnamese go.
Now, moving on to 227. We're still on 227, same page that we were looking at. And this is a discussion of a congress which took place, I believe, in August or September 1971, if I'm reading your book correctly. ERNs are in English 00396, 427, and in French 00639 74829. And this is the passage I'm interested in. Some 60 delegates attended the Congress, including all the regional and zone secretaries, military commanders such as Kay Pok and Kong Sapal, representatives of the intellectuals like Hu Yun, Hu Nim, and Khieu Samphan, and a token group of Hanoi returnees. By the time it ended in mid-September, they had approved new party statutes, ratifying the name Communist Party of Kampuchea, adopted 5 years earlier, confirmed Pol Pot as Secretary of the Central Committee and Chairman of its Military Commission. And then, of course, you described that a new Central Committee of 30 members was elected, including Chu Chet, Khoi Tun, V, and Khieu Samphan, and Khieu Ponnery. And you conclude with Hu Yun and Hu Nim were not included, neither was Non Suon or any of the Hanoi group. Just an initial clarification, I think yesterday we were having some difficulty with the date of Khieu Samphan's election to the Central Committee as an alternate member. And do I have it right now that this is actually in 1971, not later in time?
You have it right. I misspoke yesterday. It is 1971.
I'm not surprised at all, given all of the dates that we're dealing with. You say that Hu Nim, Hu Yun were not elected. Neither was Non Suon, whom I think earlier in the book you describe as a member of the Prachuapchon group, nor any of the Hanoi group. Is that of any significance, the selection of people at that point in time to the Central Committee?
Yes, it is. It reflects a view that those who came to the Communist Party from different routes were not trustworthy. The Hanoi returnees, who were those Khmers who had been part of the communist movement, the Vietnamese dominated, Vietnamese-affiliated communist movement in the early 50s, and had gone to Vietnam after the end of the war, then had come back. They were not trusted. They were regarded as too contaminated by the Vietnamese. The Prachuapchon were the group who had tried to have a normal legal existence as an opposition in Cambodia under Sihanouk, and they were not trusted because they, again, had taken a different route from the CPK core led by Pol Pot.
Thank you. Just looking at the list of people that you have included here, it appears that most of them come from regions, from various zones and sectors, except for Khieu Samphan and Khieu Ponnery, who are elected as alternates. Does that bear any significance, or am I perhaps overemphasizing this?
The central committee of a party running a guerrilla struggle is almost bound to be from the different regions, because that's where the struggle is taking place. So you have the representative people from the different regions. And in the case of the Cambodian Communist Party, the kind of central element of the leadership has always been very, very small. So it's normal.
Thank you. The next meeting, which is of interest, is dealt with at page 228, and according to the book, it was a Central Committee meeting in 1972. And the reason I'm going to turn to this now is because you describe it as a turning point, and I'll just read the relevant passage. English ERN 00396-428, French 00639-749, I believe. If I've got that wrong, I'll correct it. And you say the following: at his urging, that is Pol Pot's urging, the committee issued an urgent directive calling on the party to strengthen its proletariat stance and to intensify the struggle against the various oppressive classes who want to conserve their rights under our new regime. The participants also approved plans for the collectivization of agriculture and the suppression of private trade as soon as the situation permitted. It was a turning point. Can I ask you first on that last point, on the last sentence, why do you consider this to have been a turning point?
Because Pol Pot had just been on a 3-month-long trip through the provinces, and he came back with his impressions. Things were going too slowly. Not just that things were going too slowly, but that the stage had been reached where it was possible to go further. The Cambodian forces had been built up to a level where they were maybe not completely able to hold their own vis-à-vis the Vietnamese, but they were able to take over a growing part of the struggle. And that in the countryside, the time had come to start collectivizing, to start applying the CPK's policies.
Now, I'm going to read another passage and then perhaps spend a little bit of time on a couple of concepts here. Just 2 pages down at 230, you say the following, still dealing with period following this Central Committee meeting. Quote, opposing the revolution, whether in word or deed, usually meant death. In most cases, the offender was summoned to the district headquarters and never returned. Less commonly, exemplary punishment was meted out. In the autumn of 1970, a village whose inhabitants had rebelled and killed 3 district cadres was encircled by Viet Cong and Khmer Rouge soldiers, and the families of the 3 alleged ringleaders, 24 people in all, including children and infants, were publicly beaten to death. And you do make the point that this was an exception. A little bit further down, you say, after the Central Committee meeting in May 1972, all that began to change. Do I understand correctly from these passages that there is an intensification, a further increment here in the... I want to be careful with my words, in the extent to which these policies are being implemented, in the extremism. You will correct me if I've got it wrong.
Yes, is the brief answer to your question. There was an intensification. It was part of what we've been discussing. The fundamental reason was that the growth in Khmer forces had reached a point where it was no longer quite so necessary to win over the peasantry, to win over support by gentle means. The Khmer Rouge were better able to force people into the mold which they wished them to have. And one sees that right through the period up to 1975, and of course even more so after.
Thank you. In the preceding passage I read in relation to a directive adopted at the meeting, you quote the words to intensify the struggle against the various oppressive classes. Is that of any significance in terms of a struggle against other classes? What is the meaning of that particular phrase?
It's a little difficult to judge because you're talking about the oppressive classes in the areas where the Khmer Rouge have forces which can operate, so in what they call the liberated areas. And I would interpret it as meaning merchants, wealthier families, people in authority, which could be village chiefs, others like that, who had been associated with the Lon Nol system, with the government.
Thank you. Now, another phenomenon you deal with in this period is the issue of criticism and self-criticism and the way in which that was implemented. This begins at page 233 of your book, the lower part, and the ERNs are in English 003964333, in French 006399756, and the following pages. And here, you've already referred to Francois Bezout, and here you use an example of a self-criticism session he witnessed during his captivity. But I will start with this quote from 233. If among the population at large, levelling was imposed from above, among the Khmer Rouges themselves, the methods of choice were criticism and self-criticism, manual labour, and the study, learning by heart and reciting of Communist Party texts. Criticism and self-criticism took place at so-called lifestyle meetings held in small groups, usually twice a week. And a little bit further down, you quote Khieu Samphan as saying he called them a daily accounting of revolutionary activities. Can I ask you first, was there something that was implemented at all of the various levels of the movement in this point in time?
Yes, right up to the Central Committee.
And to the extent that you are quoting Mr. Kisampan as to some of the self-criticism sessions he attended, did he inform you as to which group he participated with in criticism, self-criticism?
No, he didn't. And I would have to look at my notes, but I think Mr. Kusampan described, and if it was not him, it was somebody else, described the study meetings that took place before Central Committee meetings. This was absolutely a ritual that criticism and self-criticism preceded the actual work session.
To the extent that they included reciting texts and study, as far as your research takes you, again, did they incorporate also discussion of some of the principles that we've been looking at? Class struggle, collectivization, etc., etc. I know a part of it was criticizing oneself, but I'm interested also in whether or not there was discussion of broader principles.
My understanding of these lifestyle meetings and of the study sessions was that essentially it's a looking into yourself and criticizing yourself. Discussion of broader principles, insofar as it existed, would have been at the Central Committee or the party branch meeting. That was a separate thing.
Moving on to yet another development in this period. Now we're at 1972, or rather still in 1972. And here, at pages 236 to 237, you are describing the gradual withdrawal of Vietnamese forces. And what I find, what is of interest here to me is what you describe as an opposition on the part of the CPK to that move, if I have it right. You say the following at 236, ERN 00396-436 in English and 00639-761 in French. By the beginning of 1972, relations with the Vietnamese were going downhill again. Hu Yun dated the change to the end of the previous year. The key factor was the increase in the military strength of the Khmer Rouge. With 35,000 men under arms, clashes with Vietnamese units were inevitably more frequent than when there were only a tenth of that number. As the CPK forces grew more confident of their ability to handle the war on their own, pressure increased for the disbandment of the remaining Khmer Vietnamese mixed units and for the Khmer Rum Do liberated Khmers, the Sihanoukist troops trained by the Vietnamese in the early months of the war, to be brought under Khmer Rouge command. On the next page, I'll just read this so that we have both relevant passages in context. You say the following: by the beginning of 1972, Vietnamese main force divisions had started pulling out of Cambodia. It was later claimed that they had been forced to withdraw and that their expulsion had been decided by the CPK at the highest level. This was untrue. They left of their own accord, indeed, according to Vietnamese documents, over the Cambodian leadership's objections, because they were needed for the offensive against Saigon and because, in Hanoi's judgment, the Khmer Rouge could now cope on their own. So does that summarize accurately what was happening? On the one hand, you appear to be describing an increase in the confidence of the Khmer Rouge troops and clashes with the Vietnamese, and then a decision by the Vietnamese to withdraw, as opposed to them being forced by the CPK.
Yes, there were two distinct aspects to this relationship. on the one hand, the Cambodian communists were very happy to have the Vietnamese there struggling, helping them in their struggle to liberate Cambodia. On the other hand, and this was crucial, the Cambodians, wanted to be in charge of that struggle. So whatever the Vietnamese did, which gave the impression, made them think the Vietnamese still want to be the boss, that was totally unacceptable. Be there, help us, but under our control.
Now, in that passage, you referred to the Sihanoukist troops known as the Khmer Rum Do. Khieu Samphan touches on the relationship between the Vietnamese and the CPK and the role of this Khmer Rum Do army. This is not in your book. It's in a book that was published, I think, after the publication of your book. So I will pass you an extract with the President's permission. Mr. President, this is the book that Judge Cartwright referred to yesterday from, I believe it's from 2007. We only have chapter 5 in English and in French as well as in Khmer. It was one of the documents that we actually sent Mr. Short, so he may have had a chance to look at it. But with your permission, I can pass him an excerpt and we can go through it.
President, yes, you may proceed. Court officer, could you deliver the document from the prosecutor for the expert examination?
Can I ask you first, do you recall receiving that document? Have you had an opportunity to look at it?
I have the document in my hand.
Thank you. I'll read this brief passage. I only have English and French Khmer ERN, so I must apologise, and I will provide Khmer ERNs shortly. English ERN 00498-275. It should be page 56 in the copy that you're looking at. And French 00643-880. I think we may have an objection.
The President. Mr. Philip Short, please hold on. The National Counsel for Mr. Khieu Samphan, you may proceed. Counsel Kung Samon. Thank you, Mr. President. Just now I listened to the testimony by Mr. Philip Short, the question put by the prosecutor, and I am of the opinion that the answer did not respond to the question. He asked whether or not the expert has known this document before, and now he responded that now he is having this document at hand. So I don't think that this answer actually responded to the question put by the prosecutor. I would like to ask the prosecutor to clarify this.
I'm not sure I understand the intervention. The document was sent to Mr. Philip Short with the trial chamber's permission. All parties were informed of this list. We sent it to everybody some months ago. So I'm not sure I understand where my friend is coming from. But the document, if you look on the case file, E127/24/7 is the trial chamber's directive permitting us to send these documents to Mr. Philip Short. That was done in September 2012. So clearly he has had these documents, and I see no purpose in this intervention. We should be able to simply proceed.
The President. You may proceed, Mr. Prosecutor.
Thank you. The particular passage that I wish to read is as follows. As for Philip Short, he provided clear evidence that in truth it was the Vietnamese that created the Khmer Rom Doc Army, Khmer Liberation Army. He wrote as follows. In theory, he, Sihanouk, led the Khmer Rom Doc that were different from the Khmer Rouge in that they wore Sihanouk badges on their uniforms. But in fact, the Vietnamese had created them, as Sihanouk bitterly noted, that he had never seen a chain of command from the bottom up to the Funk in Beijing. The Sihanoukist army received its orders from Hanoi instead. So then, Philip Short provided clear evidence that the Vietnamese had stuck their hands deeply into internal CPK affairs since 1973. And I'll stop there. To the extent that it's a characterization of your work, do you agree with that statement that you've provided clear evidence that the Vietnamese had stuck their hands deep into internal CPK affairs?
I would beg to differ from that characterization to the extent that it seems to me to be putting things rather more strongly than I did. That the Vietnamese had an interest in CPK affairs is undeniable. That the Vietnamese were largely responsible, principally responsible for arming and training the Khmer Rom Doc is undeniable. But I'm not sure that the one is evidence of the other. In other words, the fact that they armed the Khmer Rom Doc and trained them is not, in my sense, evidence that they were sticking their hands into the CPK's affairs.
Thank you. Now, again, following the structure of your book, moving on to page 240, you're dealing now with the relationship with Prince Sihanouk, who at this point is, of course, in Beijing, as you described yesterday. The ERNs in English 003964440 and in French 0039644. I'll read that again. In French 0063975. And as I said, it's page 240 of the book. I'm going to read only brief passages because we have limited time. The rare messages from the interior faction, as the CPK was euphemistically called, were sent in the name of Khieu Samphan, now officially presented as Commander-in-Chief of the People's Armed Forces for the National Liberation of Kampuchea, and transmitted via the Chinese Foreign Ministry. A little bit further down, Sihanouk was no dupe either. He said privately from the outset that the Funk would exist only for as long as the Khmer Rouge needed him, and later told the New York Times, "They will spit me out like a cherry pit the moment they have won." Do I take it from that passage that there was, according to your description of the events, little pretense, even on the part of Prince Sihanouk, that this was a true coalition?
He was very lucid. He knew what the score was. The operation in Beijing was the public face. It was the facade. It had absolutely no control over what was going on inside. They were two pretty separate things.
And then at page 242, you expand on this to the extent that there was, according to you, a wariness about the prince's popularity on the part of the CPK. The ERNs are in English 003964442, in French 006397768. You say the following: Khmer Rouge wariness over the prince's popularity meant that their troops wore no Sihanouk badges. The CPK did not display his portrait, and he was rarely mentioned at meetings. Within the party, behind closed doors, he was condemned as a feudalist, but a Central Committee directive laid down that such views must absolutely not be known to the masses and can be disseminated only within our ranks. Can I ask you to expand on that phenomenon?
Well, once again, the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, and the leadership were trying to balance two things. On the one hand, they wanted to keep Sihanouk happy enough that he would remain with them. In other words, to make Sihanouk feel that his future, however difficult it might be and however unsatisfactory the relationship between him and the Khmer Rouge, that his future led through them. So they wanted him with him. On the other hand, Sihanouk was immensely popular among the Cambodian peasantry. There was one of the reasons that the Khmer Rouge obtained recruits so easily after 1970-71 was because Sihanouk was seen as being with the Khmer Rouge, and they went for Sihanouk. If he came back and if they made too big a publicity for him, the risk was that he would monopolize, if you like, the support of the people in Cambodia, and that would take support away from the CPK. So they had to balance.
Thank you. Moving on again, following the general structure of the book, you deal with what you describe as a further mutation of the policy. This is starts at page 245 and the pages following up to about 248, 249. You were already asked questions about some of this yesterday, I believe, by Judge Cartwright in relation to rationale given for some of the radicalization. And I want to read a passage that we didn't look at yesterday and see if that assists us in understanding this development. This is at 245, so 003964462 in English. In French, it's at 006397722 You're describing the American bombardment at this stage, and you say this: more importantly, it provided the conditions for a mutation of Khmer Rouge policy, which would have come about anyway over time, but now occurred much more quickly. The outcome was a harsher, more repressive regime under which the suffering of individuals became unimportant because there was so much of it. And then you describe the uprooting of villages and the burning of homes, which I think was covered yesterday. Can I ask you, in relation to this comment, that this further mutation was inevitable? It may have been accelerated by the events of the American bombardment, but that otherwise you consider it to have been inevitable.
I think it's clear enough the direction had been set. The effect of the bombardments has been controversial. Some of the early accounts, I'm thinking of William Shawcross, speak of bombing the villages back into the Stone Age, and that explained the radicalism of the Khmer Rouge. I don't think that's true. It speeded it up, just as the Korean War speeded up the radicalization of policy in China, but it didn't change what would have happened anyway.
And I will just first provide the ERNs, Khmer ERNs, for the passage we looked at earlier from Q Sampan's book. That passage was at 00380449 in Khmer. Moving on to 248, so the next page from the one we were looking at in the second half of the page. You say the following, quote, "In Paul's mind, bloodshed was cause for exaltation. Humane feelings were a sign of weakness and should be ruthlessly suppressed. Nor was this one man's aberration. The other Khmer Rouge leaders felt the same. CPK directives ritually enjoined party members to embrace suffering and hardship in exactly the same way as the early Christians were urged to embrace martyrdom." Can I ask you to comment on this description of a broader acceptance of that policy, that this was not an aberration of one man, but rather, if I understand the section correctly, a view accepted by a broader group of leaders?
Not only by a broader group of leaders, but going down into the party ranks. And it's a comparison that's been made before, and we've touched on it without making it explicit. But the CPK was, in many ways, like a monastic sect, with the same rituals, with the same abnegation of material things, the same embrace of hardship and suffering, the same self-sacrifice, the idea that you should sacrifice everything for the revolution. I think that's one of the keys to Mr. Q Sampan's behavior, but it also applied to many others.
Thank you. You then describe what I understand to be a further step in the continuum that we've been looking at of treatment of enemies and those outside the ranks. This is at 249, page 249, and the English ERN is 00396449, French 006397767 to 777. You describe the atrocities being committed in the war by the forces of the Lon Nol regime, and you then say, quote, "That is not to say that CPK forces were any better. They too killed and disemboweled prisoners and executed suspected collaborators. On the communist side, however, it was only after 1973 that such executions became systematic. The Khmer Rouge soldiers in the field felt the change too. No longer were deserters created with indulgence. Now they were killed." Can I ask you to expand on this idea of the executions becoming more systematic from 1973?
Well, it's not so much an idea as what I was told by rank-and-file soldiers who'd been in the army at that time. There were earlier on people who fled and went back to their villages and didn't get into trouble. After 1973, the same behavior was treated differently. So it's a statement of fact, but it ties in with this tightening of discipline within the party, within the armed forces, throughout the Khmer Rouge system, which came when they felt they were ready to move on to the next stage, when victory was approaching, the Vietnamese were playing a smaller role. All these things tied in together.
Thank you. Then further down on that page and the page following, you describe a summer offensive by the Khmer Rouge troops. That's by way of context. And this is the particular passage I'm interested in, dealing with Hanoi, people returning from Hanoi. Quote, Pol gave orders that the Hanoi returnees, apart from a small minority who had proved their loyalty, should be rounded up and taken to a detention centre in Chlong district on the west bank of the Mekong as suspected Vietnamese agents. At political training seminars, cadre began for the first time to speak of those with Khmer bodies and Vietnamese minds. Most of the returnees would eventually be executed. Can I ask you to describe in the briefest of terms who the Hanoi returnees were and why, what fueled this decision in your view, if you've been able to come to a conclusion?
The Hanoi returnees were those who had been in the Khmer Viet Minh in the war against the French in the very early 1950s, and then in 1954 were, instead of remaining in Cambodia, were sent by boat to North Vietnam, where they were put in camps by the Vietnamese, and there were a couple of thousand of them. It was a significant number. And they remained in Vietnam until the early 1970s, when they came back. Many had married Vietnamese women. They were suspected of having a lot of sympathy for the Vietnamese. So 1973 relations between the CPK and the Vietnamese became more tense. The CPK needed the Vietnamese less because it was becoming stronger, its forces were becoming stronger. Suspicion of the returnees increased, and they were parked in a camp and many killed.
Am I correct in understanding that is a manifestation of that policy that we were discussing earlier in terms of within the ranks and outside the ranks, with us or against us? Or if I've got that wrong, please correct me.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It was part of the overall tightening of control as they were getting closer to victory.
You then discuss a period starting in late 1973 where there was establishment of a forward base, a place called Krokstek, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not, and a establishment of headquarters for Son Sen at Ras Mak, in this particular place I believe you discussed yesterday. You described the establishment of security centres in this period within the special zone. And of course, yesterday you described your interview with an individual who was arrested by the Khmer Rouge in this period, and his guide murdered. Is the establishment of prisons, security centres, or however one might call them, does it reflect the establishment of this more systematic enforcement of policy at this point in time at all?
It's one of the very early signs of an administration, together with the hospital, the fixed military hospital which Chun Chun established nearby. These are the beginnings of, yes, an administration.
At this point, I'd like to show you a document which dates back to July 1973. It was a revolutionary flag issue of July 1973, but actually republished in the East Zone in June 1974. I don't think you have a copy of this as yet. With the President's, well, I can ask you first whether you looked at these revolutionary flags, and if you have, we can perhaps proceed.
I have been through all the documents you sent me, including the revolutionary flags.
Mr. President, with your permission, I can give the expert an extract of this particular one and see whether he's familiar with it. I want to be clear for the record, it's not one of the documents we sent him. My understanding is simply that based on his research and all of the other issues he has looked at, there's a basis for him to review this anyway. But if you wish me to ask him whether he's seen this particular one, I will follow that procedure.
The President, you may proceed. Court officer is now instructed to obtain the document from the prosecutor and hand it over to the expert for his examination.
This is a court translation, so it might look somewhat different from documents you may have looked at in terms of its layout. But it is a revolutionary flag from July 73, apparently republished in the East Zone in June 1974. Are you familiar with this particular document?
I think I must have seen it because I believe I have read all the existing, the extant issues of Revolutionary Flag. I'm afraid that 10 years, 12 years after the event, I can't say for certain that I've seen this particular document, but I believe in all probability I have.
Mr. President, with your permission, I'll read a brief extract to the expert and see if he can assist us with it.
The President, you may proceed.
I just realized I may not have given the document number. This is E3/785. E3/785. It is entitled Strengthening and Improving the Party's Leadership Stance and Leadership Attitude. I believe we may be able to display it on the screen as well for the benefit of the public and those who can read Khmer. There is a particular passage here that I'm interested in, against the background of the discussions we've been having about arrests and executions. At the bottom of the second page that you have, Mr. Short, the ERNs are Khmer 004420478, French 0074196, and English 007139989. It's an interesting passage, and I'll read it. Quote, "At the same time, there is still authoritarianism in the bases. Thus, we must jointly improve the leading works attitudes to be more appropriate in order to make people love and satisfy us more." A little bit further down. Moreover, sometimes it is a proper stance, but due to the lack of caution of action line, it results in political disadvantage. Over the page, for example, if the spies are arrested to be executed in the meeting before the people, some people may be frightened of us. They think that we are extremely cruel. The stance to smash the spies is correct, but it is inappropriately carried out. This appears to be a sort of instruction as to how executions should be carried out. Is that consistent with your findings as to the systematization or development of these attitudes towards enemies and arrests and executions?
They dealt at, I am answering your question, but they dealt at various times with the question of how execution should be carried out and who had the authority to authorize executions. These instructions were often honored in the breach, but the guiding principle behind all of them was executing people is right when they are counter-revolutionary, when they are against the revolution, but it must be done in a way which does not harm the revolution's goals. This is an example. You don't execute people in front of others, and that, through the Khmer Rouge period, was pretty general. People disappeared, they were taken away and didn't come back. It wasn't that they were killed in front of the others.
Thank you. We're going to move towards the events in 1975 shortly, but just as we wish to exhaust a little bit more this period just immediately preceding, at page 254, you are now dealing with the view of those who are in the cities, and here I wish to build on the evidence you gave yesterday. English ERN 00396454, French 00639783-4. Quote, "This idea that all who diverged from the revolution were human vermin and should be treated accordingly, analogous to the medieval Christian notion that sinners merit the torments of hell, also coloured the party's attitude to the inhabitants of Phnom Penh, including the peasant refugees who had streamed into the city. They had chosen their side, sitting out the US bombing in safety, while the revolutionaries were blown to smithereens. They therefore merited whatever punishment rained down on them. From late 1973, Chinese-made 107 and 122 millimeter rockets were fired into the city, often falling on the poorest quarters and causing hundreds of casualties. The following spring, these were supplemented by captured 105 millimeter artillery firing at maximum range from positions south of the capital. Am I correct in understanding that you are making a connection, perhaps, between this view of city inhabitants as vermin, as those who had chosen a different side, and the shelling attacks on Phnom Penh as part of the attacks?
The shelling attacks were basically psychological warfare. They were to show that the Lon Nol regime was incapable of defending anybody. But the fact that the shelling was indiscriminate and therefore, given the range of the artillery, was going to fall very often on the poorer suburbs, that was acceptable because those people had chosen to be with Lon Nol rather than staying with the revolutionaries. So the two went together.
And do I then surmise correctly from what you've just said that there were no attempts made to avoid casualties in the city as part of this shelling?
No, there were no attempts made, but it was a war, and in war, people get killed. I'm not saying that cynically. The civilian population should be spared, but the reality of warfare is that there are very few limits on the means used to win.
The President, thank you, Mr. Prosecutor, and thank you, Mr. Witness, expert rather. The Chamber will adjourn now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Court officer is now instructed to assist the expert during the break and have him back in this courtroom by 1:30 this afternoon. Security guards are instructed to bring Mr. Keo Sampon down to the holding cell downstairs and have him back in this courtroom before 1:30 this afternoon. The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ